Picture this. You are standing on a front porch in January, barefoot on ice-crusted concrete, still wearing a hospital gown under a coat that isn't yours, holding a 5-day-old baby against your chest because you have nothing else, no bag, no phone, no car keys. The door behind you has just been locked, not slammed, locked. The kind of locked that means someone on the other side stood there long enough to turn the deadbolt deliberately and then walked away. The snow is coming down sideways. Your stitches are pulling. Your daughter hasn't made a sound in 40 seconds, and that silence is the most terrifying thing you have ever heard in your life. That was me. 11 months after I married into the Hargrove family. 5 days after I brought my daughter into this world without her father, who had been dead for 4 months. And what none of them knew, what I didn't know either, was that the woman they left on that porch was about to become the majority owner of a company worth $1.6 billion. My husband Marcus and I had been married 14 months when a driver ran a red light on a rainy October evening and killed him on the way home from work. I was 7 months pregnant. I had loved him with a quietness that didn't make noise at dinner parties or post-anniversary photos every year. The kind of love that just lives in your chest and does its work without an audience. When he died, I didn't fall apart the way people expect you to. I got very still. I went through the motions of the funeral, the paperwork, the condolences, and I held his child inside my body and told her, without words, that she was going to be fine, that we were both going to be fine. His mother, Margaret, had never made it a secret that she considered me insufficient, not aggressive about it, not dramatic. Just a low, persistent disapproval that expressed itself in small corrections. The way she'd rearrange the dishes I'd just washed. The way she'd refer to Marcus's previous girlfriend by first name in conversation, casually, like dropping a pebble into still water to watch the ripple. His sister Claire was worse because she was smarter about it. She smiled when she meant the opposite of what she was saying. She touched my arm when she was dismissing me. After Marcus died, they moved into the house. Our house. The one his salary had paid for. The one I had decorated. The one that still had his reading glasses on the nightstand because I wasn't ready to move them. They framed it as support. Margaret said it was too dangerous for me to be alone in my 3rd trimester. I was too exhausted and too wrecked to argue. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself grief was making me uncharitable toward people who were also grieving. I told myself a lot of things in those months that turned out not to be true. My daughter Nora was born 2 weeks early, on a Friday morning in February, after 14 hours of labor without the person who was supposed to be holding my hand. She was small and loud and perfect, and the first time I saw her face I understood something about Marcus that I hadn't understood before. She had his jaw, the exact angle of it, and I pressed my cheek against her tiny head and told her that her father had loved her before she existed, and that I would love her until I stopped breathing. I was in the hospital for 4 days. When the discharge nurse wheeled me out, Margaret and Claire were in the waiting area. Margaret took the baby carrier out of my hands before I had fully stood up. She didn't ask, she just took it. I was too sore and too overwhelmed to say anything. That was the moment I understand now. That was the moment they decided I wasn't going to push back. The next 5 days were a slow erosion. Margaret kept Nora in the room she'd claimed at the far end of the hall, too far for me to hear her cries at night. When I asked to breastfeed, Claire would arrive with a bottle already prepared, saying it was faster. When I mentioned calling the pediatrician to ask about the feeding schedule, Margaret said she'd already spoken to him. My own daughter's pediatrician. In my own house. I was moving through the rooms of my life like a visitor who'd forgotten to bring identification. On the 5th day, I woke up at 2 a.m. with the specific panic of a new mother who has not heard her baby in too long. I went to the room where Nora slept. She was there. Fine. Breathing. Her small chest rising and falling in the soft glow of the nightlight. I stood over her for a moment, just watching her, and then I picked her up because she was mine and I needed to hold her. That was when Margaret appeared in the doorway. What followed was not a conversation. It was a wall of words I kept trying to get through. Something about my state of mind. Something about postpartum instability. Something about how the pediatrician, who I had never actually spoken to directly, had expressed concerns. I held my daughter and I kept saying, very quietly, "She is my child, Margaret. She is my child." Claire appeared behind her mother wearing the face she wore when she had already decided what the ending of a scene was going to be. Then came the words that I will carry inside me for the rest of my life. Not because they broke me, but because of what they revealed. Margaret said, "Marcus would have wanted her raised properly. We've already spoken to a family attorney. We can make this very clean if you cooperate." I looked at her for a long moment. Nora was awake now, her dark eyes open and unfocused, one tiny fist pressing against my collarbone. I said, "I'm not signing anything. I want you both out of my house by morning." Margaret looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided is not a real obstacle. She said, "That's not how this is going to work, sweetheart." What happened next took less than 10 minutes. Claire packed a bag that was not my bag. Margaret held Nora while I was told, with the calm authority of someone who has rehearsed this, that I was going to take a few days away to rest, that Nora would be fine, that no one wanted this to be difficult. I reached for my daughter and Margaret stepped back and something in me collapsed under the weight of a body that had given birth 5 days ago and hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since. My hands were shaking. My incision was throbbing. I heard myself say please in a voice I didn't recognize as mine. Claire opened the front door. The cold came in immediately, a hard, flat cold with teeth in it. She set the unfamiliar bag on the porch. Margaret was still holding Nora. I looked at my daughter's face one more time, and then I did the only thing I could think of, which was walk onto the porch without making it worse, because something in me knew that if I fought them physically in my condition I would lose, and losing meant not coming back. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. I sat down on the top step because my legs stopped working. The snow was coming at an angle and within 2 minutes my hospital gown was soaked through where the coat didn't cover. I had no phone. I had whatever was in a bag a stranger had packed for me. I could not feel my feet, and somewhere on the other side of that door my daughter was making the small sounds she made when she was hungry and no one who loved her was answering. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the cold to stop feeling sharp and start feeling like pressure. Long enough for my thoughts to slow down in a way that scared me. Long enough that I had stopped expecting anything to change. Then headlights. A dark sedan pulling up to the curb. Not fast, not alarmed. 2 people got out. A woman in a heavy coat, moving with a kind of professional steadiness, and an older man with silver hair and a folder tucked under his arm. The woman reached me first. She said my name. She said, "Mrs. Hargrove, we've been trying to reach you for 3 days. My name is Dr. Lena Park. I'm your husband's family physician, and I work with the Hargrove Estate legal team. We need to get you warm right now." I said, "My daughter is inside. My daughter is inside that house." She looked at the older man. He was already on his phone. I was in a hospital room on the other side of the city within 40 minutes. A real one. This time. Not a luxury suite. Just an emergency room where a doctor I'd never met looked at my incision and the color of my lips and put a warming blanket over me and told me I had another 15 minutes before I would have needed a very different conversation. Dr. Park stayed. The older man, whose name was Richard Calloway, and who turned out to be the senior partner of a firm I'd never heard of, sat in the plastic chair in the corner and waited until I stopped shaking before he said anything at all. He told me about Marcus's grandfather. Edward Hargrove Sr. had built a logistics company from a single truck in 1971. By the time Marcus was born, the company had become a network of warehousing and freight operations across 11 states. Edward Sr. had outlived 2 wives and one of his 3 children, and by the time he was 81 years old he had decided, with the clarity that sometimes comes at that age, exactly what he wanted to happen to the thing he had built. He did not want it disassembled by his surviving children's financial habits. He did not want it sold to people who didn't know what it was. He wanted it to go to the branch of his family that had actually worked Marcus, who had spent every summer of his teenage years in those warehouses and had become, quietly and without fanfare, the person his grandfather trusted most. Edward Sr. had created a trust, not a public one, not one that Margaret or Claire knew the specifics of. A trust that placed controlling shares of Hargrove Freight Holdings in the hands of Marcus's direct heirs, meaning Nora with me, as guardian and trustee, until Nora turned 25. The trust had a provision that Margaret and the rest of the senior family had tried and failed to contest 3 years ago, before Marcus and I even met. When Marcus died, the trust transferred automatically. It had been waiting for me to be located and notified. Richard Calloway's firm had been trying to reach me through the house phone, through Marcus's email, through channels that, it turned out, Margaret had been quietly intercepting. The company was worth $1.6 billion. I looked at the ceiling of that emergency room for a long time. The fluorescent lights made a faint sound. Somewhere down the hall, someone was crying and someone else was laughing at something on a phone. I was 29 years old and I had been sitting in the snow 30 minutes ago, thinking about whether my body temperature was going to hold, and now a man in a good coat was telling me I had inherited controlling interest in a freight empire that employed 14,000 people. I said, "Where is my daughter?" Richard said. "Our team has already contacted Family Services. There is no legal custody order in place. Nora is your daughter by birth and by law. We're working on getting her back to you tonight." He paused. "We have documentation of the situation at the house. Security footage from a neighbor's camera covers the front porch. It captured everything." I closed my eyes. I thought of Marcus. I thought of the way he used to leave a cup of tea on my desk when I was working late, without saying anything, just appearing and disappearing. I thought of all the times I had sat in that house, feeling like I was trespassing on my own life. And I thought about how he had apparently known, from the very beginning of our marriage, that I was carrying something valuable forward. Not money, not shares. His daughter. The continuation of something he cared about. Nora came back to me at 11:47 that night, carried through a hospital door by a social worker who handed her over with the careful formality of someone who understands the weight of what they're holding. I took her and sat down in the chair against the wall, and I didn't stand up again for a long time. She was warm. She was fine. She looked at me with Marcus's eyes in her father's face, and I held her so carefully, like she was made of the only real thing left. The weeks after that were not simple, but they had a different quality than the weeks before. Dr. Park arranged for a postpartum care team. Richard and his colleagues briefed me on the trust, the company, the legal landscape. I learned, in fragments, what had been kept from me. That Margaret had known about the trust's existence, though not its full scope. That she and Claire had believed that with Marcus gone and me in a fragile state, gaining custody of Nora was the fastest path to legal standing over the trust's management. That the family attorney they'd mentioned had drafted paperwork giving them temporary guardianship. That they had been planning to present it to me at the hospital before I was discharged, and I had been discharged a day earlier than expected. I sat with all of that for a long time, not with rage, with something quieter. The specific grief of understanding that people you had tried, genuinely and repeatedly, to accept as family had seen you from the beginning as an obstacle and a resource, in that order. I started meeting with the executive team at Hargrove Freight Holdings 3 weeks after I left the hospital. I want to be honest, I didn't know what I was walking into. I had been a pediatric nurse for 4 years. I knew medication dosages and discharge protocols and how to explain a diagnosis to a parent who was barely keeping it together. I did not know what a freight lane analysis was, or how a warehouse management system worked, or what EBITDA meant in any practical sense. I sat in my first briefing with 11 executives, and I took notes on everything, and understood about 40% of it, and came home and spent 3 hours that night learning the other 60%. What I had, and what I hadn't expected to have, was a team that had loved Marcus. They spoke about him in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves, and the ones who were too professional to say it out loud said it with their eyes. He had been good at the thing he did. He had been fair and specific, and had a memory for people's names and circumstances that made everyone who worked with him feel like they were seen. I wasn't him, but I was his daughter's mother, and I had his grandfather's trust literally in my hands, and I was not going to let either of those things down. 6 weeks in, Richard came to me with an update I had been expecting. Margaret and Claire had retained a new attorney. They were pursuing a formal custody petition on grounds that I was emotionally unstable, financially unproven as a guardian, and had been previously observed behaving erratically at the family residence. The petition alleged that I had left voluntarily on the night in question, that the family had been concerned for my mental health, that they had been caring for Nora in my absence and were better positioned to provide stability. I read the petition twice. Then I set it down on the kitchen table where Nora's bouncer was sitting, and I watched her move her fists at the ceiling mobile for a moment, and I said, out loud to nobody, "Not this time." The day before the custody hearing, Richard told me that Margaret had also submitted a request through the company's investor relations channel, asking for a meeting with the estate trustee regarding a proposed management transition. She still didn't know. Neither of them knew that the trustee they were writing to was me. They thought the trust was still in the process of identifying a guardian and that they were maneuvering to be appointed. They had no idea that I had been sitting in the boardroom for 6 weeks. The courthouse on the morning of the hearing was cold and fluorescent in the way that official buildings always are. I wore a dark blazer over a blouse I'd borrowed from someone on the legal team who was close to my size, and I carried Nora in her carrier against my chest because I refused to be separated from her in that room for any reason. Richard was on my left. Dr. Park had agreed to testify. The neighbor whose security camera had captured the night in question had submitted a signed statement. The emergency room physician who had treated me had documented everything. Margaret and Claire were already seated when I walked in. Claire saw me first. I watched it move across her face, confusion, then recognition, then something she quickly tried to rearrange into composure. She put her hand on her mother's arm. Margaret turned. The thing about that moment was not the power in it. People who have been through it know that confrontations like that are not triumphant the way movies suggest. What I felt was a very deep stillness, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for something. I took my seat. Nora shifted in her carrier and made a small sound, and I put my hand over her back. Margaret's attorney argued the case they had built, that I was unstable, isolated, without family support, financially inexperienced, that I had abandoned my child under emotional distress, and that the Hargrove family represented stability and continuity. I listened to all of it without expression. I noticed Claire watching my face for a reaction, looking for the version of me they had expected to see, the one who would go quiet and small and comply. That version wasn't there anymore. When it was my turn, Richard presented the medical documentation from the night in question. He presented the neighbor's security footage, which showed me sitting on the porch in a hospital gown in January, barefoot, while light from inside the house remained on for another 40 minutes. He presented the audio from the same recording, Margaret's voice clear and steady as she told me that this was going to happen the way they'd decided and that cooperation was my only option. He presented my current living situation, care team, pediatric check-in records showing Nora at every scheduled appointment, letters from the executive team at Hargrove Freet attesting to my competence and reliability. The judge asked Margaret directly, "Do you have any explanation for what is depicted in this footage?" Margaret's attorney tried to interject. The judge held up her hand. Margaret said, "She was distressed. We were trying to help her see reason." The judge looked at the footage timestamp. She looked at the emergency room intake form. She looked at Nora, asleep in the carrier against my chest. Then, Richard laid the final document on the table. The trust instrument, my name, in black ink, as trustee and guardian. The company name, the figure. Margaret made a sound I had never heard from her before, something involuntary that she tried immediately to swallow. Claire's hand went to her mouth. The judge ruled within the hour. Petition denied. Full custody affirmed. Sanctions imposed for filing a demonstrably false claim. The case referred to the State Bar for investigation of the opposing attorney's conduct, and a quiet note in the ruling that the security footage had been forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. I didn't watch their faces when it was read. I watched Nora. She had woken up sometime during the ruling and was looking at the ceiling lights with the focused intensity of a very small person encountering fluorescence for the first time. I touched her cheek with one finger. She turned toward my hand. I thought, your father would have loved this particular moment. He would have stood up straighter and not said anything about it afterward, and that would have been enough. In the parking lot, Margaret caught up to me before I reached Richard's car. Her attorney was still inside. She was alone. She looked older than she had in the courtroom, the composure peeled back by something. She said my name. I stopped. I turned around. She said, "We built that company. Edward Sr. built it and Marcus grew up in it, and it belongs to this family." I looked at her for a long moment. Nora was against my chest, her face turned outward toward the cold air. I said, "Nora is this family, and I am her mother. That's what the trust was for. Not you, not the estate. Her. He built it for her." Margaret's mouth worked, but nothing came out. I think she had expected me to be afraid still, or angry, or some version of the woman she had left on the porch. I wasn't any of those things. I was tired and I was clear, and I had a 12-week-old daughter who needed to get out of the February cold. I said, "I hope you find something real to hold on to, Margaret. I genuinely do." Then I got in the car, and I didn't look back. The year that followed was the hardest and most purposeful of my life. Running a company you didn't know existed 4 months ago, while caring for an infant, while grieving your husband, while also, somewhere in the margins, beginning to understand what you are actually capable of that is not a triumphant montage. It is a long sequence of days where you make one decision and then the next one and then the one after that, and some of them are wrong and some of them are right, and you learn the difference slowly. I hired people who were smarter than me in areas I didn't understand. I kept the ones Marcus had trusted. I asked every question that occurred to me, even the ones that felt embarrassing to ask, and I discovered that the executives who had worked for my husband respected directness more than the performance of knowledge they already had. I made 2 significant management decisions in my first 6 months that Richard later told me were exactly what the company needed. I made one that wasn't, and I reversed it and explained publicly why. That last part, apparently, was unusual enough to be worth noting. I started a foundation the following spring, not for the optics of it, but because I had spent 14 hours in a hospital emergency room understanding, in a way you only can from the inside, what it feels like to have nowhere to go. We focused on housing and legal support for mothers in housing crisis. The woman who headed our intake program had been through something close enough to what I had been through that we didn't need to explain the mission statement to her. She already knew what it was for. Nora started pulling herself up on the furniture the week the foundation's first shelter opened. She had her father's jaw and my stubbornness, and a way of looking at things she hadn't seen before that made her seem, at 11 months old, like she was already taking notes. I used to narrate the world to her while she sat in her carrier during my early morning work calls. "Here's what a freight manifest is," I'd say. "Here's what it means when a regional depot is underperforming. Here's why it matters." She would watch my face with the expression she'd inherited from her father, the specific one that meant, "I'm listening. I'm already 3 steps ahead of you. Keep talking." On a Tuesday morning, almost exactly a year after the night on the porch, Richard came to my office with an update I had been waiting for with less urgency than I might have expected. Margaret and Claire had sold the house. Claire had moved to another city. Margaret had applied, through a housing nonprofit that was not connected to our foundation, for transitional support. She was approved on the merits of her application. She would never know the organization's connection to me. I thought about that for a while, about what it would have meant to me a year earlier to know that she would end up there. I waited for the satisfaction of it, and what came instead was something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not indifference either. Something that felt more like setting a thing down after carrying it for long enough that you can't quite remember what it felt like to have your hands empty. I walked down the hall to the small room off my office where Nora was with her nanny, working on the architectural project of stacking and unstacking a tower of wooden rings. I sat down on the floor next to her. She handed me the red ring with the authority of someone delegating an important task. I took it. I put it on the post. She considered this for a moment, deemed it acceptable, and handed me the yellow one. My husband loved this company because his grandfather built it with his hands, and then poured everything he learned into the structure of it, and then trusted that the right person would carry it forward. Marcus trusted me with the most important thing he was leaving behind. An old man I never met trusted the continuity of something he built to a woman he'd only seen in photographs. And a 5-day-old girl who had survived a January porch with her mother was going to grow up knowing that the people who were supposed to protect her had failed, and that she had been protected anyway, by the stubbornness of love and the strange persistence of things built to last. On the morning of the Foundation's first-year anniversary, a reporter asked me what I wanted people to take from my story. I thought about the question for a moment. Nora was in the lobby with her nanny, charming the receptionist with the focused dedication she brought to all social interactions involving adults who underestimated what a 1-year-old could comprehend. I said, "I want them to understand that the people who underestimate you are the ones who can't see you clearly. And that's their limitation, not yours. You don't have to earn the right to be protected. You were always worth protecting. Some of us just had to find out the hard way that the people who were supposed to protect us were the ones we needed protection from. And when we did find out, we got up. That's all, we got up." The reporter wrote it down. Nora, from across the lobby, pointed at me and said a syllable that had not yet resolved into a word but contained the full weight of everything she meant by it, which was, "I see you. I'm here. We're in this together." I pointed back at her. "Same. If this story found you in a moment when you needed to hear it, I hope it helped. And if you are standing in your own storm right now, if the door has just locked behind you and the cold is coming in and you cannot see what comes next, please don't give up. What comes next is not the storm. What comes next is you, deciding to stand up."